Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please subscribe to the channel if you like our videos and our fantastic guests, and it will also help you discover the great guests we feature in future. And also please do consider becoming a patron to support the work we do. Today I'm talking to Konstantin Samoilov, a well-known YouTuber whose channel Inside Russia comments insightfully on Russia's descent into authoritarianism over the last few years. But now, like many others, he's outside Russia, with no idea when he can return there. And this is our third conversation. I'm delighted to announce that Konstantin and I will be doing a monthly feature where we unpack what's going in Russia, what the impact of the war is on the economy and politics, and hopefully we'll bring the latest insights to our audience. Konstantin, I'm delighted to welcome you back again.
Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan. It's a pleasure and honor to be here.
Well, we've got so much to unpack. I think we spoke relatively recently, but so much has gone on. There have been momentous changes with the Prigozhin mutiny, the second Kerch Bridge attack, the firing of senior army officers within the Russian army. We'll come to all of that stuff and unpack it in a minute. But I wanted to start with a really interesting video you posted on your channel, and that was discussing this idea of normality in Russia. And of course, there are many people who are trying to create as normal a life as possible. But is there such thing as normality? Is that even possible? Can people block out all the horror and terror and events that are going on?
Answering this question, let's take a few steps back into history. Normality is actually a very, very important concept for Russian people. And it has roots into the early 90s and the collapse of the USSR. Normality actually used to exist in Russia. It was called the stability. It was Vladimir Putin's mantra. It has been mantra for the past 23 years. You see, it was the key idea of his presidency. I should say his ruling, not his presidency. When USSR collapsed, the new country, Russia, was born, and it went through a process of the great change, the great turmoil. Communism system was replaced with capitalism. The planned economy was replaced with free entrepreneurship, and it was done overnight, literally. Okay, you can replace it overnight, but you cannot fine-tune it overnight. Okay, it takes time for things to change, and it was fundamental change in all areas of Russian society, and it started in early 90s. A fundamental change everywhere, including the economy. And financially, people were hurting so much. They were having very, very hard times. I remember that time well. We didn't know what to do. We were sort of reinventing the wheel. We were thrown into a stormy sea and said, hey, learn how to swim or drown, basically. And Russian folks had very, very, very difficult time. I call that time the Great Turmoil. And then Putin showed up in 2000. And he clearly saw the demand for ending this turmoil. He saw the demand from the society for some kind of stability. People were extremely tired from this turmoil, and he played that card perfectly well. He started to claim that one of his main goals of his presidency was to bring the stability back to Russian people. There's a catch, though. Putin didn't do anything. Russians went through 10 years of turmoil, and in the process, they reinvented the wheel. They learned how to swim. And then in 2000, it's just coincidence. Oil prices started going up, and of course, oil and natural gas, Russia's bread makers. So Russian economy started doing so much better just from increase in oil and gas prices. So, and then Russian people basically started showering in money. And then their problems were over, and the time of stability, a certain stability, a better life came in the 2000s, okay? And Putin's been playing that card of the stability so much. And ironically, he's the one who destroyed the stability for the Russian people. He's destroyed the civil society, he's destroyed the economy, he's destroyed everything. But the thing is, people still remember the 90s, and they still remember the great turmoil, and they don't, you know, they fear that. And lots of folks understand that that turmoil is back, you know, back into their lives. So what they're trying to do right now is to create bubbles, informational bubbles, and pretend everything is all right, everything is stable, everything is normal inside their bubbles. Because once they look outside the bubbles, they're going to be hurting a lot. They will understand that things are not well. So basically, that's what I think.
And Putin's stability came with a kind of conditions, didn't it? And one of those conditions was you will not get involved in politics, or at least you will not be successful in politics. You know, the minute you start to become a tangible rival, you know, that game is over. So there were certain rules to this stability which would not necessarily be familiar to, say, a Western audience.
I call this social contract between Russian people and Putin or the government. There have been two social contracts. The first lasted from, let's say, 2000 to 2011, 2012. And then the second one, the current one, replaced the previous one at around 2012. The first contract was this: Russians started enjoying life for the first time, perhaps, in the Russian history, okay? And I'm talking about 100 years back. For the first time, Russians felt like they could afford things. Their lives improved greatly, materially, and they were accepted in the world. They could travel, they could do things before unimaginable, okay? And they could afford them. Life was good, and it was intoxicating. I remember, because I returned to Russia in 2004, and I remember it was intoxicating. Everyone was making money. You know, the prerequisite for good life was you had to work. Okay, if you worked, if you did things, you were compensated nicely. And Russians started traveling all over the world, started buying cars, electronics, houses. They were just having so much fun living life for the first time ever in their history, that they didn't really care much about politics. They didn't care about the government. Back then, the role of the government was much lesser than it is now. You got to understand. In the 90s, government literally was so little, it did not exist in Russians' lives. But the government, the Putin, used that situation very wisely, and he started grabbing more and more power, stepping stones, boiling the frog type of thing. But the first social contract was this: Russian people said, you provide us with all this money, with all these possibilities, with a great economy. And as long as you keep us rich, you can do anything you want. The second social contract was, its current one is different. Russian government pledged to make Russia great again. And what is the price? Well-being of Russian people. Hey, we need all the resources, we need all the money, we need all the power, because we're surrounded by the enemies. The enemies are trying to destroy us. The enemies all around us, they're trying to put us down on our knees. But we will prevail. You know, we will not let them do that to us. But, you know, you got to tighten your belts. You got to give up certain freedoms. because it's for your own safety, for your own good. You're going to be living in a great country. And this is the current social contract that Russians have with the government.
And of course,
This,
many people...
I'm sorry, this contract has led to the war with Ukraine, to basically the Russian government started doing things unchecked.
And of course, we'll come to that in a minute, because this, there's almost theoretically no end to where that could go. And as the clock winds back through the 90s, I get the impression from people who, traveled in Russia or were sort of academics at the time in the late 70s, that actually there was more of a civil society in the late Soviet period. There was, in some ways, more freedom, and there were certainly numerically fewer political prisoners at that point. So this clock is winding back. My fear, actually, even in 2021, was that this clock was going to wind back to the 1930s. That is the low point of governmental power. Almost, you could call it governmental insanity, where it declares war on its own people for ends that it finds logical, but which to an outsider appear completely inhumane. I mean, do you share that fear that we're on a fast track? I mean, to an extent, you could almost argue that the Donbass area and occupied territories in Ukraine are already living in a Stalinist period of completely arbitrary lack of justice, terror, torture. I mean, that world already exists on Russian territory, as is defined in the constitution. Belarus, not that far behind. Russia is not yet at that stage, but what are your fears around that?
Jonathan, it's hard to disagree with you. We are definitely back into the past. It's not 1939, because back then people were just taken and without court procedures were just executed in days by tens of thousands, the Red Terror. What's happening now is people are not getting executed, but they're just taken and thrown to prisons for things that not too long ago were not considered crimes. So it's laughing matter. For the likes in the social media, for the reposts, for saying things like, I am against war, for going to the Red Square and holding Leo Tolstoy book, War and Peace. Okay, that's considered a crime now in Russia. So we're not there yet, but we're on the way, on a fast track back then. Yes, I agree with that very much. And yes, I do agree that what they call the new territories of Russia now, there's lawlessness. It's just such a tragedy for people who live there, as they were conquered, as the conquerors announced that it's the new territory, and basically there's lack of law there, and it's the rule of power, and just, I don't know, it's terrible.
I mean, I remember in the 90s speaking to people, I mean, that generation has passed now, but speaking to people whose relatives, grandparents actually witnessed the revolution. And in particular, people who are sort of close to me, the revolution in 1917 obviously happened and the Civil War unfolded, but it actually took many years for that process to move eastwards. If you were deep in Siberia, it would have taken several years for that sort of red terror or the impact of the commissars from Moscow to really change your life. And many people have described that process that their relatives, told them about. It wasn't that you suddenly had some, organized government that came in, some kind of ordered change. What happened is all the layabouts, the drunks, the criminals, the down and outs, all the sort of dregs of society and those who didn't have a place in a well-ordered, functioning society, they were suddenly told, right, you're in charge now, steal whatever you like from whoever you like. And one can't help but think that that same lawless process is unfolding, certainly in the occupied territories, and those territories where, the Russian army was given full reign to its sort of chaos and violence.
It all started with Donbass in 2014. and it has spread to these new territories. Unfortunately, I think you're right, and it's hard to disagree with you. It's tragedy.
Now, some of the audience will hear this idea of Putin's stability, and they'll be slightly skeptical. But I think there is some really interesting and compelling data when you look at the changes in longevity. So the average lifespan of a Russian sort of man and woman, and that went up incrementally through the sort of 60s and 70s. Once that sort of post-war period and a certain amount of sort of stability and sort of basic consumerism sort of was kickstarted in the Soviet Union, you saw incremental improvements in living standards. Then in the 90s, it absolutely collapsed, atrocious figures. And I think what's interesting about the early Putin years, that first decade up to 2014, is there were huge increases in the standard of living, as you mentioned, but also longevity actually went up and up and up year on year. So that does talk to some positives from those stable years. Then 2014, it's no coincidence, 2014, that number starts to go down and degrade. We don't know what the current figures are, but I think they're going to be atrocious. This speaks to, this longevity data tracks the arc of, I think, Putin's regime, but also points to some very scary kind of demographic changes in future. What are your fears there for the demographics and the impact that will have on Russia's politics in the years ahead?
First of all, Jonathan, I'm not really sure why would anyone question or be skeptical of the changes that took place in Russia in early 2000s. It was very obvious. There were so many signs. All you had to do is you had to come to Russia, I'd say in 1994, to Moscow, to any other city, and then in 2008, and you would have seen a huge difference in people's lives, everywhere, including healthcare, including increased life longevity and so forth, but like really everywhere. Demographic situation in Russia is, I don't know, how do I describe that? In the future, it's a catastrophe. Does that describe well enough? I'm not sure. There are two problems, well, many problems, but probably two or three major ones. First, how many men have been killed at war? And that's not just a tragedy for Russia, that's even a bigger tragedy for Ukraine, because Ukraine is innocent, okay? It's some country, a neighbor came and started killing men and women, and, what the hell? For Russia, lots of men have been killed. That definitely will not help demographics in the future. The numbers have different experts give different statistics, but this general idea that between 1 and 3 million Russian men have fled Russia in the last 16 months. I tend to agree with the higher number, 3 million Russian men, or perhaps a little less than 3 million, but that's still huge. Why? Because I am in Tashkent and I'm simply looking around myself, I'm looking around, I'm seeing how many Russians here. I'm right next to Kazakhstan. I've been to Kazakhstan a couple of times. I see what's happening there. I am in contact with different refugee groups of Russians all over the countries, all over the world, basically. We are organizing refugee network, so to speak, right now. This is huge. Not even a problem. It's a catastrophe for Russia, for the future of Russia, for the future generations, because not only the numbers went down greatly. I mean, that's around 2% of population. And I don't even know what percentage of men, young men of that. That's much greater. But the cream of the crop have left. The ones who are very capable of working, sustaining themselves, of opening businesses, generating taxes, creating value for the economy, creating products. Those people who have high self-esteem, who know how to, who rely on themselves to learn another language, to settle themselves in a different country. Those, the best of the best. They should stay in Russia. They're like a train engine. They should be pulling Russia into the future. They have left. And the third big problem is instability that none other than Vladimir Putin has brought up onto Russia. People don't want to plan families because what's going to happen in the future, no one knows. We went through this before. In the early 90s, there were tons of kindergartens. They were just empty because there were no children attending. There were simply no children in Russia. And then they were retooling kindergartens into offices, and then Russians started to have babies again. We had a huge problem, not enough kindergartens in the 2000s, right? So what we're going to be seeing right now is simply there will be no births. And the government understands, and there are some officials are addressing this issue, but they're just addressing it in a crazy way. Just like one of the Russian senators came out now, Minister of Health came out yesterday and said that it is absolutely wrong for women to work and to create careers. Instead, they just should have babies. You know, make babies and that's it.
I mean,
That's
that
Ministry of
statement is,
Health.
I mean, that statement wouldn't be out of place in the Taliban, would it? I mean, that is an extraordinary affront to Russian women, actually.
Where has Russia gone to? This is crazy. You're absolutely right. I'm still speechless. That's the Minister of Defense speaking. I'm sorry, Minister of Health speaking. Not Minister of Defense, Minister of Health. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. So Russia is up for a rocky future in every area, including demographics.
And this is probably a good point. Well, there never is a good point to bring this up, but Prigozhin's mятеж, his mutiny, as I think many commentators are now calling it. This was an extraordinary moment. Do we still really understand what happened there? And is there likely to be a repetition? I mean, this is the kind of instability, the extreme instability, which would put anyone off having children, surely.
Jonathan, what we're seeing right now is absolutely sad and amazing time at the same time in Russia. I link this kind of events to the events of late 80s, because what happens in Russia, crazy news, they come out every single day. Okay, that's as unstable as it can be. Okay, and it shows you that Russia has entered the period of very, very, very hard, rocky time, I should say.
Time of trouble.
Prigozhin, yeah. Right, troubles, times of troubles. Prigozhin, what he did was unthinkable even a couple months ago. Okay, he actually invaded Russia because he was stationed in Ukraine without permission. He came back to Russia. He captured 1 million people city, Rostov-on-Don, in a matter of hours. He captured all government agencies, including KGB, Army, HQ, top Russian generals, publicly humiliated them. Okay, he killed, he downed multiple aircraft while doing that. He killed 15 servicemen, Russian servicemen, who were trying to somehow to defend Russia from mutiny, okay? And he moved on to Moscow, publicly announcing he was to topple Vladimir Putin. Then he stopped not too far from Moscow, and he was bought out of the mutiny by Vladimir Putin. So see, Russian president could not fight his way out, could not suppress the mutiny, but he bought his way out. Okay. It is absolutely obvious to me that most things are hidden behind the surface about this mutiny, and we are given very little information. And what we're seeing on the surface does not explain the whole thing. It is obvious that there's so much more behind the mutiny. It's obvious that Prigozhin was not by himself. He was supported. Truth starts coming out bits by bits, but I think there's much more to come out. For example, the rumors have it that General Surovikin was part of ЧВК Wagner. I mean, Russian at the time, he was in charge of the whole Ukrainian war. Okay, he was a part of Wagner. He has this medallion or thing that soldiers put right here. I'm not sure how you call it in English, but he had that. He was part of ЧВК Wagner and a personal number of ЧВК Wagner. It's unthinkable, right? So he's definitely been a backer, and quite a few generals, because guess what? Quite a few generals have been fired, have been missing. Most likely they are being interrogated, charged with anything. We don't know yet, but something's going on. So we do not have all the answers, but I certainly have lots of questions, and I'm pretty sure that the truth will come out.
And it also suggests that, I mean, Prigozhin is a particular character. There's maybe nobody else quite like him or like Wagner in terms of their sort of status in Russia. But it does suggest that there could be a repetition by Wagner potentially, but other groups. It certainly opens the door to increased instability, doesn't it?
The door was opened quite some time ago, and Wagner was just the first attempt. And actually, it planted the seeds of chaos, of the civil war, possibly, or definitely a coup d'etat. Because look, Wagner was a loner. Yevgeny Prigozhin was a loner inside the Russian system. Okay, granted, he was Putin's cook, and granted, he has personal relationship with Putin, but he was in conflict with the Ministry of Defense and with every other agency. There were rumors that FSB just absolutely hated his guts. Okay, and Putin was the only person who was trying to balance this, the situation with Wagner. And despite all of that, Wagner was able to move as close as 200 kilometers from the Kremlin, and people say it's a failed mutiny attempt, a coup d'etat attempt. I say it's a very successful one, because Prigozhin, made a deal. It's great success for him, for Russian government, for Putin. That's a huge disaster, because he's showed everyone that, look, I am weak. I'm not strong to fight my way out. I'm not strong to suppress whoever has a take on my power. The best I can do is I have money and I can buy my way out of trouble. Okay, that's not good for a dictator, because Putin's system exists only under condition that Putin is strong, and he makes sure that his orders are executed very precisely, and if they don't, he punishes. Okay, as soon as people in the government start seeing that Putin is weak, then there will be other takes on his power. And look what we're seeing right now. This is the second mutiny. It's brewing right now, but that's not Wagner anymore. That's much more serious. That's the Russian army. See, Russian army is the deal breaker. The army for any dictator is the last resort of defense. Okay, if the army supports and protects, things are well. But most coup d'etats, it's the army. who turns against dictator, and that's it. It's over. This is basically what happened in 1991. The army was ordered to move into Moscow, and it did. And then the army was ordered to disperse the crowd, to start shooting at people. And General Lebed, he said, I'm not doing that. He disobeyed the order. He moved his tanks out of Moscow. Other generals saw that, and they started joining. They started not following the orders of the communists, okay? And that was it. The Soviet Union was done in one day after that, okay? This, how much of a power that army possesses. That's the final ultimate power. And what we're seeing right now, there's mutiny brewing inside a Russian army. A war general, Ivan Popov, was fired a couple of days ago for speaking up the truth. Basically, what he did, he stood up at a huge meeting and he said, look, all is not well in the kingdom of Denmark. Look, we're having problems, this, and that, with lack of artillery, lack of rotation of the troops, lack of leadership. I mean, I am sitting in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, Jonathan. I understand that he is right, okay? There's not news for the Russian generals, but General Major Ivan Popov, who is respected by Russian troops, okay, who is, I'm not saying he's a good guy, he's a criminal, war criminal, but he is better than other generals, okay, more popular. And he came out and he spoke the truth. And for that, he was fired. And most likely, his firing is not the end. You know, he's most likely he's going to be punished in some other ways. But he makes an address after that, and that address is made public through a Russian senator. And, you know, that address, you must have heard of that, right? It flies all over the world. Mm-hmm. And his troops stand up and they say, hands off the general, our general, because if you punish him, you're going to regret that. His troops actually also made a statement that has been kind of downplayed by Russian propaganda, being erased from the media space right now.
Solovyev lost his mind. I mean, if you heard the broadcast of Solovyev after that, he went absolutely crazy.
I did not, but I will. I don't really follow Solovyev.
That's why.
Just... I'm sorry, but he's just absolutely nuts. But so what's happening is this guy, the war general, who spent last 18 months in Ukraine, and he knows the situation from the inside. Okay, he's been with his troops. He starts calling Minister of Defense, his boss, okay, and the Chief of Staff, traitor, who has betrayed Russian people and Russian soldiers and Russian people. And he's supported by some of the senators. And he's supported by some of the generals, because he cannot act on his own. Hey, that's a brotherhood. That's a camaraderie, okay? And it's happening right now. So I'd say there's another mutiny much more serious for Vladimir Putin is in the works.
And what was interesting as well this week, now obviously the second attack on the Kerch Bridge is what has been dominating headlines. What I found actually far more interesting was the responses of the propagandists. Yes, it was condemned. Yes, threats were made, all the usual kind of stuff, but it wasn't, no, it didn't have that shock factor of the first time. Now it's become like, yeah, so they've attacked the bridge. It's predictable. They'll probably attack it again. But the key bit for me was Skabayeva and others. And I know, I'm sure you don't watch them either because they're horrific people. But she brought up a picture of Dmitry Medvedev and she started basically mocking him, saying, oh, well, he's come out with this threat and that threat. And then she said, but of course, they're probably not going to do anything about it. These are hollow, empty threats. So here you have nominally the number two in Putin's system. Well, in power terms, he almost certainly isn't. But you have a key symbol of the Putin regime and his inner circle being mocked by the propagandists, being shown to be hollow, impotent, and in some ways pathetic. You know, that also is quite an interesting development.
Jonathan, I do watch Skabayeva sometimes. You see, Solovyev has completely gone nuts, but Skabayeva is the mouth of official propaganda, Russian propaganda. She's on TV. Solovyov is on YouTube. You know, his audience is a little different. So I do watch her. I watch RT. I watch Simonyan to kind of understand what they're up to. You're absolutely right. What we're seeing right now is a perfect example of how effectively Russian propaganda works. Because bombing of the Crimea Bridge is huge. It was huge in the very first time in October, and it's huge now. They said so many times in the past, oh, this is a red line. And if Ukrainians cross that red line, oh, they're gonna regret it. Oh, they're gonna regret it so much. And, you know, just like Skabeva, you know, quoted Medvedev. And the first time it happened, there was no retaliation. The best retaliation they could do is start bombing residential complexes in Ukraine, so start sending missiles, okay? That was their revenge. That's pretty low. And right now, this huge flow of the tourists, I don't really know what they're thinking, you know, that go back and forth to Crimea. I think the government has hyped up vacationing in Crimea, so it has the human shield. And then hopefully Ukrainians wouldn't hit because, you know, they would be afraid of hitting civilians. So, and, you know, just notice that Ukrainians picked the time with the lowest traffic time of the day, you know, because if they attacked in the daytime, the casualties would be so much more. So anyway, they bombed the Kerch Bridge, the Crimean Bridge, and Russia has nothing to retaliate with, really, because the king has no clothes. But what propaganda needs to do, it needs to show that, hey, look, it's not a big deal. Don't worry. We will, of course, retaliate. And they make an attempt to bomb some facility in Odessa, and then they start screaming out loud, oh, we have taken our revenge, you know. So they're trying to downplay, they're trying to show that things are normal in Russia. Okay, there's nothing extraordinary because we go back to the normalcy, you know, the normality, the stability. Everything is cool, everything is stable, nothing to worry about. Yes, there was bombing, but not a big one. And, you know, it's going to be recovered. The bridge will be fixed soon. And, of course, we will retaliate. We have taken revenge already. We bombed them. Where did you bomb? That doesn't matter, you know, we just bombed them. Just trust us, okay? That type of thing. Perfect example how Russian propaganda works.
And it does work, doesn't it? And I find it extraordinary. I mean, one of your really interesting videos recently was discussing, are Russians going to, in future, take responsibility for this war, even if, you know, information comes out and the propaganda machine is dismantled and so on, as unlikely as that sort of seems at the moment. But this seems to me, you know, this issue perfectly exemplifies it. If you have tens of thousands of people going on holiday in a war zone, in occupied territory, because, you know, it's a bit cheaper and the beaches are nice, etc., that, and I'm going to put a label on it, that moral vacuum or that lack of empathy with, you know, a war that is happening just literally a few steps away from where they are holidaying, it suggests that those people are very unlikely ever to take any responsibility for this war or look inside themselves.
Jonathan, this is one of the biggest unanswered questions for me personally. I've been trying to answer for myself since the war has started. I don't understand. I'm trying to make explanations. I'm trying to come up with logical explanations. The best one I have come up so far is we clearly are seeing that most Russians do not accept the responsibility for this horrendous war. Most of them feel it's not them. Most of them feel it's their government, okay? But they are not a part of the government. They are not a part of the system. They distinguish themselves from the state. The war, it's something that the state, the Russian government, Putin is doing. The state is responsible for that. And if it turns out that there have been crimes, that it's the state, most likely they're thinking this: I am as far from being a part of Russian state as I am from the moon, okay? I influence nothing. I have no importance. I decide nothing in the life of Russia. Everything is decided for me by my government, because some people think they know better, or some people think, well, they've taken all my rights away from me. But what can I do? It's not me who is responsible. It's them. It's the state. They control everything about my life, about our lives, you know. And this is the general understanding of the situation among Russian people. But that's the biggest problem, is it does not make them not responsible. Okay, they are very responsible. They just don't realize that. Some genuinely think so. Some have made up their pretty pictures in their heads. But you know what? Sooner or later, their bubbles will be burst, and sooner or later they will face all those crimes that were made in name of, I don't even know, Russian stability, Russian greatness, the Russian world, whatever. I think the history will repeat itself, and the Russians will be facing the same situation that the Germans were facing in 1945. Those Germans who didn't know supposedly what was happening, up from like right in front of their own nose, you know what I mean? So I think the same thing will happen to Russians. They will be forced to face responsibility.
Yes, no, I think that that would be progress, though, because by moving on from that, by accepting responsibility, it allows a certain liberation. It allows political processes to begin, political consciousness to develop. That would be a positive development, even though many Russians would think it's not. And it has a curious echo for me as well. In the 90s, talking to people of that generation who were, 40 plus, who were brought up in the Soviet Union. And as you say, in one day, that Soviet Union collapsed and disappeared, and a new sort of vacuum emerged. And that was echoed, and many people said, like, oh, well, the Soviet Union, well, we see all these crimes and things. We see these documentaries now about, the crimes committed during the Soviet Union. But, I mean, we weren't part of that. We had no responsibility for that. We were victims too, So you had this same distancing from history, this same sense, even in the 90s, that people, even though they lived through it, even though they might have been part of the army, the administration. I mean, one person I was speaking to was head of HR in a strategically important industry. We know what that means. Almost certainly she was a KGB informant of some type. And she was like, no, USSR, nothing to do with me, nothing to do with us. So unfortunately, yeah, I mean, this seems to be history repeating.
You're so right. And I am kind of seeing the same way. Although in the 90s, a lot of people were ashamed, and they were saying that, but if you would sit down and have a shot of vodka with them in the kitchen, and you would try to look, break this barrier and become more personal with them, a lot of people were ashamed. What's happening right now? Yes, I think history repeats itself. The history is repeating itself. Two problems. First problem, there was no illustration. The very same people who ran the USSR, they were allowed to run New Russia. The KGB was not dismissed, and everyone was not fired, The army people were not replaced, the police. And the second problem is there was no closure. There was no acceptance of guilt, not guilt, acceptance of responsibility for what the USSR, because Russians were not just the only victims. I mean, look at the Eastern Europe. I haven't heard any Russian coming out and say, no, I'm so sorry that what we did to the Polish, to the Czech, to the Slovakians, Hungarians. No, but that's where it should have started in the first place, and then traveled like, okay, now let's talk about our internal problems. So, and I think this time when the regime will change in Russia, hopefully we'll have a chance for a better future. That's what we need to start with. Lustration. Everything is being recorded right now. Everything is being monitored. And, we do not forget, and we shall not forgive once, ends. And the second is, we definitely, all Russians, we have to accept the responsibility, and we have to face consequences, and we have to pay the price.
And the last question, because I know we're sort of running out of time now. The last question, and this is really your core area of expertise, is the economy. I think it's difficult for us to understand at a distance, and there's huge disagreement actually amongst Western academics and economists about the actual impact of sanctions. The long-term strategic impact is probably going to be quite high on many industries, as we discussed before. But what do you think people are experiencing in their everyday lives, or those that are running businesses? Are sanctions having an impact? Is it catastrophic, or are people able to work through it?
I always make analogy of Titanic, the ship that sank. When the iceberg hit the Titanic, it happened for a very short time. 30 seconds, something like that. There was lots of noise, lots of commotion, lots of screeching the metal, and then everyone got outside and they saw a pretty innocent picture. There was Titanic going forward, and there was the iceberg, somewhere behind. Okay, and everyone started celebrating, saying, wow, we almost hit the ice. We were so close to being in trouble. Okay, but thank goodness we're fine. But the problem was that the damage was done. The hull was penetrated, and the compartments started getting flooded. Titanic was afloat for about over an hour after that. And for the first 30 minutes, no one knew anything. The only people who were aware, probably the ones who were working in the compartments, and the captain, perhaps the engineer of the ship. For 30 minutes, nothing was happening. And then the second people started noticing, when the ship started angling down a little bit by bit. But then right after, the process became very fast and very violent. And in like hour and a half, Titanic was on the bottom of the Atlantic, and so many people died. Russian economy is pretty much like that. You see, a couple things. It had huge reserves because Putin and his gang, they had been stockpiling money for the Black Day, I guess. And when the war was declared, well, never was declared, but when Russia attacked Ukraine and the war started, what happened was panic in the world, in the markets, and the price of oil and gas went up. And Russia was still exporting oil and gas at the time, and it benefited greatly. Okay, it was raking in money. The first half of 2022 was huge budget deficit, huge extra revenues. But then the West has woke up and decided to put sanctions upon Russia. So the milestone was December 6th. That's when Europe stopped buying Russian oil, and price cap for Russian oil was implemented. Okay, now the exports of Russian oil are down big time by about 47%. Same goes for natural gas. It's really hard to sell. Russia basically does not sell natural gas anymore because it doesn't sell to Europe, and you cannot sell it anywhere else. You must have the infrastructure, the pipelines. So the bread makers of Russian economy have halved. Okay, have been hurt tremendously. And the expenses have gone up tremendously because Russia is de facto a war economy, and the expenses for military stuff have increased tremendously. Plain and simple. I mean, what is there to argue about? In order to understand what's happening, the compartments have been flooded. Those reserves that were accumulated last year, they're being emptied out right now, okay? Russia is not getting much of the export revenues anymore, but it's spending a great deal for producing missiles and bullets and shells, you know, things like that. That's very basic stuff you need to know about Russian economy. And to say to those Western experts who say that Russian economy is going strong, well, just one example. All right, if you take an economist in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, and you ask him or her, what is the interest rate of your central bank? And they'll give you the example. And if you ask, well, what if your interest rate was 7.5%? They would say, no, that's not good. Well, Russian interest rate is going to be higher than that in 2 days because inflation, the prices are skyrocketing for everything. And to keep the interest rate, to keep the inflation under tabs, the central bank must increase the interest rate. That's how the economy works. But that is a huge blow to economy. Even though it's war economy, still a huge blow. The industries have collapsed. Many industries, most service industries, okay, most manufacturing, everything that is not connected to military has collapsed, imploded, okay? I don't really understand how people can talk about Russian economy going strong and withstanding all the troubles. Russian ruble is trading at 90 for $1 American right now. Is this a good sign? Well, that's a very, very short explanation, short summary of what I think of Russian economy right now.
Well, we can unpack it in more detail in our next episode, but there was an interesting statistic that suggests that personal and business bankruptcy is really starting to kind of hockey stick up as well. And that would be an inevitable outcome of the raising of interest rates, wouldn't it?
Russian banking, I would say, is on the verge of collapsing because what the banks are doing, they're trying to give out as many loans as possible. I feel it myself. Although I am in Uzbekistan, I still get calls every single day on my Russian phone. You know, salespeople offer me loans. I don't need loan. And when I tell them that, they get stunned. Like, what do you mean? You don't need money? No,
Everybody
I don't.
needs
Right. Everyone is we can give you what? You don't have anything to buy. For example, maybe you wanted to buy a car. And the thing is, the loans are given at the record high numbers right now, but the defaults are also hitting the record high numbers. Okay. The banks live as if it's the last day. They try to make as much money right now, this month, next month. What happens in 3 or 6 months? You know, they'll fall. They will deal with it then. Okay, so this is what's happening. The business defaults will be huge because the industry's collapsing, economy is shrinking, economies in decline. Obviously, businesses will have a hard time paying out their debts, and the personal loans also is a huge disaster. People losing jobs left and right. You know, inflation is skyrocketing. This is crazy, Jonathan. This is a huge wave that is coming. This is right there in front of Russia, and it's just a few months, perhaps, until it breaks over the country and just buries the financial system.
So those that are saying, and I've heard this from many military experts, and it actually drives me crazy, they say, no, this war could last for years. I get the impression from what you say and from what I'm seeing that it is entirely improbable that Putin's regime can continue to fund the Siloviki and the forces that keep him in the Kremlin, that he can bribe everyone and pay everyone off and keep this economic bubble going for years. It seems extremely improbable.
Jonathan, I'm not a military expert. I've said it many times, and I don't know how the war can go on. But I am absolutely positive that the changes to this war, they will come from within Russia, not from the front lines, not from the Ukraine, but Russia will implode from within, okay? It nearly imploded 3 weeks ago when Prigozhin declared mutiny. He declared that Putin made a huge mistake and he was moving on to topple him. Okay, and that was just the first one, the precedent, so to speak. There are two major problems for Russia. First is the economy. They cannot sustain the war economy with what's going on right now. And the second is there are so many people that are sitting sharpening their swords and asking themselves one question: will I make it the first one? Perhaps someone will be there first before me. Who that will be? So that's the only question on their mind. And that's the second, well, can't say it's a problem. I mean, it's a blessing, really. But that's the changes will come from the inside. And then it's not going to take ages for the changes to happen.
I think that's a great place to end on. That is certainly, for those supporting Ukraine, quite an optimistic thought there, because Russia imploding essentially means a Ukrainian victory. Konstantin, I very much look forward to picking this one up because I feel so much is going to happen in the next couple of weeks prior to our next episode. But it's been deeply fascinating unpacking all these issues. As always, I share with my audience extreme gratitude for your candor and your insight, and I would say your moral compass on the various issues we discussed. It's been a huge pleasure, as always.
Jonathan, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. It's fantastic. It's morally and intellectually pleasing for me. Thank you.